Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to continue our study of European absolutism by continuing to move east and discussing the consolidation of power of the Russian czars and the creation of Russia as a modern European state. So, here are our objectives for today, and let's dive in. The creation of modern Russia, like the creation of many societies, can really be tracked back to the Mongol conquests. As you hopefully remember from previous classes, the Mongols took over a spectacularly broad swath of Eurasia, eventually conquering all the way into what is today Russia. The Russian areas of the Mongol Empire were eventually known as the Golden Horde, and although they did rule the area for about 100 years, eventually the Mongols fell into decline, and Russian powers started to reassert themselves. You should also know that historically, parts of Russia had been controlled. The northern parts of Russia had been controlled by a group of Viking descendants known as the Kievan Rus, and so the ethnicity of Russia is this weird mix between sort of European, Asian, and Slavic that's very difficult to sort of define. So this sense of Russianness is kind of a slippery concept, at least at the beginning. The Duchy of Moscow was one of the key administrative districts in the Empire of the Golden Horde, and the princes of Moscow became some of the most important administrators within the Mongol Empire. This gave them significant prestige over their other rivals for the throne, and as the Mongol Empire declined and eventually collapsed, the princes of Moscow continued to hold the sort of elevated status that they had gotten when the Mongols controlled this area. And so Moscow is going to become one of the central cities of Russia and one of the most important cultural areas of what eventually becomes the Russian Empire. The first prince of Moscow who claimed the title of Tsar was Ivan III. Ivan III started to consolidate territory, started to become a new monarch, creating a standing army, copying a lot of the things that other European powers had done, and sort of consolidating his control over what would eventually become Russia. It's Ivan III that came up with these two concepts that are most central to the Russian understanding of rulers, the concept of Grozny, or awesome/terribleness. It's a weird translation. It's somewhere between great and terrible, so awesome or awe-inspiring is as close as possible. And Tshaishi, the idea that the Tsar or the leader is a father to his people who should be looking out for their best interests. And so, in the Russian leader, we have these two concepts combined, these two ideas of awesome power and loving care for their people. And every Russian leader gets their legitimacy from having these sort of two traits, sort of similarly to how Confucians describe the various traits that they have, that they see in their rulers, and that gives rulers legitimacy or the mandate of heaven in China. Going all the way back to the 16th century, Russia saw themselves as having a clear religious destiny. Russia, as a religion, is predominantly Eastern Orthodox, which is the survivors of the eastern part of the Christian world after the split of the Roman Empire into two halves, with the Roman Catholic half controlling Europe and the Eastern Orthodox half of the Byzantine Empire controlling this sort of areas. The Kievan Rus converted to Christianity and became Eastern Orthodox, but after the fall of Constantinople, which is often known as the Second Rome, Moscow became the key center of Eastern Orthodox religion in the world, and so it's very important to Russians that Russia carries on that sort of religious legacy that they trace all the way back to the founding of Christianity. Ivan IV was another Tsar who also had, to some degree, the values of Tshaishi and Grozny. He used, again, his military power to significantly expand Russia. His first half of his rule was pretty positive for the Russian people in general. But as he got old, he got very paranoid. He had a secret police or a special police that would dress themselves all in black and sort of carry out his interests throughout the empire. And he got very unstable later in his life and was prone to bouts of murderous rage, most famously when he killed his eldest son after a conflict. And then he went on a reign of terror, executing thousands of Russian people, which is why Ivan IV is often known as Ivan the Terrible. And here we see a picture of him holding the lifeless corpse of his son after he beat him to death. The Tsar who did more than anything else from the Romanov dynasty to create modern Russia is Peter the Great. Peter the Great was a important military leader. He grew up sort of amongst soldiers' camps and was fascinated with all things military. He had his own regiment as a child and would practice drilling with them in order to ensure that he was a skilled military commander. He also grew up to be a giant of a man, as many of the Romanovs did. Probably close to 6'6", Peter the Great would tower over more or less anyone else he was around, and his physical prowess was also one of the things that remarked him to his people. He would carry around a large stick, which he would use to beat the people around him in order to enforce proper behavior. So the Emperor of Russia is literally wandering around with a huge club, and he would club you if he thought you were behaving improperly. And he was obsessed with dentistry and would often demand that he was able to do impromptu dental work on anyone who wanted to talk to him. And so not only would he beat you up if you acted improperly, but you're definitely losing teeth if you go to meet with the Tsar. So, Peter the Great, interesting dude. He went on a journey across Europe, so pause and take this in as far as what he's looking for. These travels were designed to make sure that he was sort of up to date on the latest sort of European techniques in both schooling, in architecture, in agriculture, in military designs, in shipbuilding. For this grand embassy, he ostensibly went disguised, so he would intentionally dress as a peasant in order to try to go around unobserved and look at stuff. But here's this 6'6" Russian guy, followed by a retinue dressed as a peasant. It was pretty clear to everyone who he was, and so he was generally given the royal treatment wherever he went, spending significant time in England to learn about English shipbuilding, and specifically bringing back the concept of the university to Russia, significantly expanding their educational system, and increasing the amount of knowledge that the average Russian people would have. So, he also wanted to make Russia a more modern-looking country to Europeans, and so he attempted to force traditional Russian nobles, known as boyars, into dressing in a European style. And so he brought back European clothing styles, European styles of facial hair, and he specifically pushed back against the long Russian beards, which he felt like looked old-fashioned and dropped Russia's status in the eye of the world. And so famously, he instituted a beard tax where anyone coming in and out of a city would have to have a token, would have to pay for a token to keep their beard. And he would also give people impromptu shaves if they wanted to meet with him. So not only is Peter the Great possibly going to beat you up, he's going to take your teeth, and he's also going to shave your beard if you want to meet with the emperor. And so this was another way for him to sort of control the nobility and to exert his own tastes and preferences on the Russian people. And so over time, of course, people did this to some extent to emulate him, and of course because they didn't want to pay the tax and have to carry one of these ridiculous beard tokens. He's also going to mandate education for at least the nobles. And so we're going to see Russian nobles going to European-style universities that are provided to them for free, and this will help them take places within these new growing Russian industries and within Peter's various bureaucracies. Peter the Great was also known as the Westernizer because there's these two sort of pressures in Russia. Some Russian leaders sort of double down on their own traditional culture. These are known as the Slavophiles on account of Russia's traditional Slavic heritage. And then there's this school of thought called the Westernizers, where they would argue that Europe should be the focus of Russia, and that Russia, as opposed to looking back at its old traditions, should instead focus on attempting to emulate the more advanced European societies, your France, your England, your Prussia, things like that. And so Peter the Great decided to bring in Western techniques. He brought in new crops, including the potato, which is going to significantly increase the productivity of Russian farming. And he's going to try to construct a new port city, because one thing that Russia lacked at this point was they lacked access to any sort of body of water that doesn't freeze during the winter. Russia, of course, as you see from this map, has substantial amounts of coastland, but the vast majority of the Russian population is sort of in the Volga River Valley here and these areas. And so their western coast is not super useful because Russia is a vast territory. And in the north, 8 months out of the year, these seas are frozen, and so you're not able to get ships in and out. So Peter wanted to create a new warm water port that he envisioned, a new city that would be named after him, at the mouth of the Neva River. He would call it St. Petersburg. The problem with the construction of St. Petersburg is that Russia did not at this point control this territory, and so this provoked a war with the other great northern power at the time, the Swedish Empire. The Swedes were sort of at the tail end of their potential or their attempt to create a great northern empire. And so the Great Northern War was between Peter the Great's modernizing Russia and the Swedes. It was a particularly long war, and although the Swedes got the upper hand at the beginning, eventually Peter the Great's forces won, and Peter was able to take the territory over sort of south of Finland, where he would construct his new capital, the city of St. Petersburg. With the construction of St. Petersburg, Peter would then be pushed to relocate the nobles from Moscow and their own traditional areas to his new capital, far, far in the west. This had the same effect as Louis XIV's creation of the Palace of Versailles, and would disconnect the nobles from their traditional territories and their sort of spheres of influence, and put them right under the nose of the Russian Tsar, making them much easier to control. After Peter's death, there was a massive succession crisis, and after going through a couple of somewhat incompetent leaders, eventually Peter's second daughter, Elizabeth, seized control of the throne with help from the Russian military. She would construct the famous Russian Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, which would become the seat of Russian government and would house a lot of Russian nobles, very similar to the Palace of Versailles. So hopefully you're seeing some parallels from these successful leaders as far as the tactics that they used in order to marginalize the power of their political enemies, increase their own power and status, and increase the general power of their country. So we'll leave us with Elizabeth and her young son Peter, who's eventually going to ascend to the throne, and we'll return back to Russia to pick up their story later. So that's the lesson for today. Hopefully you can answer these questions in some detail. Thank you for listening.